From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to the Free Expression podcast from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already a subscriber to Free Expression, please sign up wherever you do your podcast listening. This week, Britain turns left. As President Joe Biden continues to battle for his political life here in the US, in other Western democracies, incumbent governments are being routed by their electorates. France goes to the polls on Sunday and will elect a parliament in which President Emmanuel Macron's governing party is likely to be dwarfed by a combination of left and right-wing populists. Meanwhile, in the UK on Thursday, Independence Day over here, of course, the Conservative Party, which has ruled Britain for 14 years, was trounced by the opposition Labour Party. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Tories suffered the heaviest defeat in their long electoral history, losing 2/3 of their seats in the House of Commons and seeing their national vote share slump by almost 20 percentage points to just 24%. Also, its worst showing. Under the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who took office on Friday, the left-of-centre Labour Party won a landslide, on a par with Tony Blair's big win in 1997, with a majority of more than 170 seats in the 650-seat Commons chamber. But there were plenty of twists in this otherwise widely expected tale. Labour's share of the popular vote at just 34% was the smallest ever by a party winning an election. Now, the growth of alternatives to the two main parties means that in a winner-take-all electoral system like the UK's, in which the leading candidate in each district takes the seat, Labour was able to translate a small overall vote share into a massive over-representation in Parliament. The fragmenting electorate meant big gains for Reform UK, a new right-wing populist party that secured 14% of the vote, although it won only 4 seats, as well as the centre-left Liberal Democrats, who won more than 70 seats with just 12% of the vote. Very strange outcomes in terms of translating votes into seats. The other big story was the near annihilation of the Scottish National Party, which campaigns for Scottish independence from the UK. It lost 38 seats in Scotland to drop to just 9, finally crushing any lingering hopes that nationalists might have had for Scotland to break away. So what does it all mean? Has Britain really taken a sharp left turn? What kind of Labour government will now rule the country? And who is Keir Starmer, its new leader? Americans will get their first chance to see him next week when he makes a trip to Washington for the NATO summit. And what wider lessons might we draw from the wreckage of the Conservative Party? And what about those rising alternative parties? What do they mean? Well, I'm pleased to say to discuss all this week, I'm joined by Tim Montgomerie, one of Britain's foremost political commentators and thinkers. Tim founded the Conservative Home website, the leading vehicle for conservative news and ideas in Britain. He's been comment editor of the Times of London and served briefly as an advisor to former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And Tim Montgomerie joins me now. Tim, thanks for joining Free Expression.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I should warn your listeners, though, as well as this too funny British accent, I have now been asleep for 36 hours, so I hope I make enough sense.
I think you mean awake, but I think you had a Joe Biden moment there,
Yeah, I did. Oh, my goodness. Well, there we are. I'm proving my point immediately.
Joe Biden probably has been asleep for the last 36 hours, but so that's for another conversation. Anyway, Tim, thank you very much for joining us. Look, let's get straight into it. I want you to explain to our listeners what you think this new Labour government might be and what Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, might be. But let's look at the results to start with. Massive majority for Labour as expected and an absolute rout for the Conservative Party. As I said in my introduction, there are some interesting details in there, though not least that Labour won this majority with a very, very proportionally small share of the vote. What's the main lesson here as we stand just a day after the election? What's your main takeaway from this?
I think I'd like to be less parochial than I think a lot of the British commentary's been, Gerry. And we've had the British election yesterday. We've got French Assembly elections in a couple of days' time, which might see, Marine Le Pen's party become the dominant party in French politics. You've just referred to Joe Biden, and the whole American political scene at the moment is not what it was, with both mainstream parties, major parties facing big challenges. The far right in Germany recently came second in the European elections. I could go on. And now we've seen the British Conservative Party, perhaps the most successful of Western democratic parties in the post-war period, suffer one of its biggest defeats. Yes, there are particular issues in Britain, particular issues with the Conservative Party, but I think we should begin with that sort of basic reflection there's something in the water at the moment in Western democracy where mainstream parties are failing, voters are rejecting them. The waves of populism that some people thought had been reversed keep coming forward. We are not in a usual period for our post-war democracies.
You're absolutely right. We're going to see what happens in France on Sunday. We've seen what happened already in the European elections, with Donald Trump now solidly ahead of Joe Biden, according to the opinion polls. And yet, this election in the UK doesn't seem to fit that pattern from a superficial perspective. The government that's just been elected is a left-wing government, a Labour Party headed by a pretty, solidly sort of in the mainstream left of centre, with a huge majority. Britain seems to be bucking the trend, or are we missing something?
It's a complicated picture, but what I would say is that Labour won 34% of the vote, I think. We'll have to wait for final figures to be confirmed. But they have won an historic majority on the back of just 34% of the vote. That's the lowest percentage that a new incoming government has ever won. And I don't think, though, that will be the main thing that history will record about this election. I think what we may be seeing in Britain is the end of the two-party system. On the right, you have the Reform Party led by the Brexiteer Nigel Farage surging forward. They only won 4 seats, but they won a very large percentage of the vote, 16, 17%, I think. You saw the Green Party, quite a radical left party, picking up seats in both Conservative and Labour areas. Again, not many seats, but quite a big share of the vote. And then you saw the Liberal Democrats, the traditional party of protest, coming back into British politics, really increasing their number of MPs by about 5 or 6-fold. So what was traditionally in Britain a fight between the Conservatives and Labour has become much more complicated. And I think it does actually fit that same pattern of voters rejecting the old order.
One thing that is clear, and one thing they certainly did reject, is the Conservative Party's share of the vote down to about 24%. I think it's lowest ever, down to 121 MPs. I think it's going to end up with a parliament of 650, losing 2/3 of its seats from the last parliament. Tim, a view I think that's quite popular over here, especially among probably Wall Street Journal readers and listeners, is that the Conservatives have been rejected because they weren't really conservative. We were all familiar now with what's happened in Britain in the last 10 years. The highest tax Conservatives have put up taxes, they've raised spending, they've kind of at least acquiesced in this sort of woke revolution that we've seen. They haven't really made much of an effort to push back against that. Legal immigration is at record levels. I think a lot of people here just look at that and say, well, look, the Conservatives haven't been conservative, and a lot of people have rejected that. Is that fair, or is it too simplistic an explanation?
I think it's half of the explanation. The Conservative Party has done those things which it said it would not do, and not done those things which it said it would do. Immigration is up, you're right, to levels that are higher even than the Labour government that the Tories criticised. The tax burden is at the highest post-war level. Home ownership rates are declining. And yes, you're right, wokerism is expanding in much of the British public sector. And the result of that has been the Conservative Party's traditional advantage that it dominated the right of British politics. It had no sort of rival party carving up that half of the political spectrum, has been lost. Nigel Farage's Reform Party means that the right is potentially now more divided than the left. But I think it would be wrong just to see it in terms of right, left, Brexit, Remain, liberal, illiberal, or however you would want to sort of carve up the ideological spectrum. The Conservative Party's other traditional big advantage was that it was seen as the grown-ups in British politics, the people that could fix problems, the adults in the room, the party that was made up from people of business, people from the military, people who had hinterlands. And actually what the Conservative Party has looked like in recent years is a party of posture, a party of politicians who were obsessed with the news cycle, couldn't deliver a policy programme. So it's not just about policy objectives, it's just that basic ability to govern well. And we haven't been a serious party. And for me, that serious-unserious divide is perhaps the biggest one in the Conservative Party at the moment. And one, now we're going to have the position of opposition, one we can have to use the opposition years to put right.
I mean, the striking thing about the election results, Tim, is, as you say, for the Conservatives, this massive decline in support, it does seem to have gone both ways. I mean, as you said, the Reform Party, which is this sort of, for our listeners, this populist Conservative party, was essentially founded by Nigel Farage, who was very much the moving force behind the Brexit referendum. They did very well, and so they got 14%. The Tories clearly lost a lot of votes to them, but they also probably lost a lot of votes to Liberal Democrats, which is this sort of slightly left of centre alternative. Not many people, I think, switched straight from Conservative to Labour. So the fact that the Conservatives lost probably in equal numbers both to, a kind of more populist right-wing party and to a kind of more centrist party, doesn't that just kind of reinforce the problem for the Conservative, not just the Conservative Party, but more broadly, as Conservatives look at Britain from around the world, where do Conservatives go? Because again, if you govern as they have done in the last few years, you end up losing, as I say, both to the populist right and to the sort of centre-right, centre-left. What's the message in this for where Conservatives should be heading?
I think that takes me back to the point I just made, really, Gerry. I think a lot of people who don't perhaps always like Conservative policy positions find the Conservative Party perhaps less compassionate than the left. The left talk a lot about caring, and, the party, I think it was Winston Churchill once said, if you're not a socialist at the age of 20, you haven't got a heart. And if you're not a Conservative by the time you're 40, you haven't got a head. I think it's attributed to Churchill. I'm not sure he actually was the first person to say it. But that basic idea that regardless of your sort of ideological preferences, if you go to the centre-right party, when you want a mess cleaned up, when you want competence, it's going to be tricky to get Liberal Democrats back if the thing that the Conservative Party only addresses is a sort of problem on the right of the ideological spectrum. But I think if it becomes a serious party of grown-ups again, offering real, serious, thought-through answers to what are problems that all Western democracies are facing because of demography and debt and division, we know the issues. And I think that will allow it to appeal to grown-up voters who may be in the Liberal Democrats as much as they're in Reform, tempted by Reformers, tempted by Lib Dems.
Again, looking at this, as you rightly put it, in a sort of a more global, certainly a Western perspective, we're all very focused on what we fear is the decline of Western civilization under demographic, economic, social trends, the rise of the left through the institutions that have kind of essentially trashed the whole idea of Western civilization. I think this is clearly what's behind a lot of support for Donald Trump here, this sense that we want to sort of take our country back. Are you saying that that would be, a wholehearted embrace of that more populist message, anti-immigration, much stronger sense of national identity, much stronger pushback against the kind of woke revolution? Are you saying that that would be a mistake for the Conservatives? You don't think that's the way they should go?
I'm not saying it's a mistake, but what I would say, for example, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister before Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister that lasted just 6 weeks, she, on the face of it, was a very right-wing prime minister. She promised to cut taxes. She promised a very hawkish approach to China. She promised to attack wokery. But she was basically useless. And she lost her seat, which is one of the majestic things about first past the post. It doesn't always give, the absolute representation of all voters. But when the herd moves, it moves. And when voters really want to get rid of someone, first past the post allows that. And they really wanted to get rid of Liz Truss. I don't think a lot of people who voted against Liz Truss in what is normally a very Tory seat were voting for higher immigration or for higher taxes. They were voting against her because she was basically rubbish at the job. She assumed that just taking an ideological position was enough. And because she didn't understand markets, because she didn't understand how government and machinery worked, she triggered something of a run on the pound, on a run on markets. A traditional grown-up Conservative Party wouldn't have done that. Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't have done it because she understood that government was tricky. And the Conservative Party haven't looked like they really know how the world works in recent times. They've looked like student politicians taking positions that work well over 24 hours in a newspaper, but don't actually turn around the country's fundamental weaknesses. I'm not saying the policy positions need to be junked. I think we just need to be much more serious about how we actually deliver the promises that we made to people.
You seem to be saying that a large part of what happened on Thursday was a rejection of the sort of the chaos, the misrule, the venality, the bad behaviour. We saw that stuff with Boris Johnson and Partygate, and then we saw, in this election campaign, the stuff of some of Rishi Sunak's closest colleagues making money by betting on the election. Does that sense of misrule, as much as an ideological rejection, just a rejection of misrule?
Absolutely. Bad administration, just people who didn't do their basic jobs properly, couldn't make the trains run on time.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more on the results and meaning of the British election that took place on Thursday, Independence Day, with Tim Montgomerie, leading political commentator. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Tim Montgomerie, founder of Conservative Home website in the UK and a leading political commentator. And we're talking about the results of the British election, which took place on Thursday, and what it might mean for the rest of the world. You're a conservative thinker, but you're also a very deep thinker about politics more generally. Let's look at this new Labour government. To a lot of American listeners in particular, maybe the first time they've ever heard his name. Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party after Labour's own rout of an election just 5 years ago, when people will remember Boris Johnson was elected with a huge Conservative majority. The Labour Party was then led by Jeremy Corbyn, an out-and-out Marxist, sort of pro-Hamas, anti-Western leader. The Labour Party, thank God, fortunately, was routed. So Keir Starmer, a lawyer, had been formerly the Director of Public Prosecutions, which is a sort of position in the UK equivalent to something like the Attorney General, the person responsible for deciding on major criminal prosecutions, became a Labour MP. He took over from Jeremy Corbyn after that election in 2020, and he has clearly repositioned the Labour Party in such to the point where he's got it into this extraordinary position of a majority. What's he going to be like? Is this a sharp turn to the left by Britain when the rest of the world seems to be going right? What's your expectation?
I don't have any idea, Gerry.
I'd like you to explain it, because it's a good point.
Labour lost 4 elections in a row. And, that must have done something to the psyche of the Labour Party. They were very anxious about losing a 5th. They feared the Conservative Party, traditionally, a great election-winning machine. And they didn't have to fear it at this occasion, because I think we've probably fought the worst campaign I can remember in British electoral history, really. We don't need to go over the gaps, but it was a disaster. But because I think they feared another defeat, because they've been so used to losing to the Conservatives, they put forward a prospectus for government that really had nothing for the Tories to attack. They were very cautious on tax. They were very cautious on reforming public services. They didn't want to risk having some weakness in their programme that the Tories would exploit. So Labour have won a majority to govern, and a huge majority, but the actual policy mix hasn't inspired, and we don't really know whether they are going to continue to be cautious, or whether actually when they do look at the problems the country faces, we've become quite a low-growth economy. We have very high house prices, with young people really priced out of the capitalist system because they can't get the access to capital that home ownership represents. Our public services, including the free at the point of use National Health Service, has huge waiting lists. There are lots of problems in Britain. And in that manifesto for government that I've just described, Labour really didn't set out any policy ideas proportionate to the challenge.
They're quite woke, aren't they? I mean, I know Starmer's sort of adjusted his position a bit, but it was only recently that Keir Starmer suggested that the definition of a woman was a very complex thing, and he couldn't give you a straight definition of a woman. They all took the knee after the George Floyd stuff. They made a big deal out of solidarity with that cause and other causes. I think it's probably fair to say they've tried to trim some of that, and some are less woke than others. But one can criticise the Conservatives for having kind of acquiesced in a lot of that. A lot of these, they're pretty enthusiastic about it, aren't they, most of these Labour people?
They are. And, I think throughout the Western world, one of the things I most worry about is not so much that this Labour government will put up taxes, although I think they will, but I've already mentioned that the tax burden in Britain is already a historic high. I'm not sure how much higher they can go without really damaging the economy. But what we are seeing in a lot of big corporate companies is the backdoor nationalisation of them, if you like. All big companies now have human resource departments, environmental delivery units, equalities departments, really mandated by forms of social legislation, which are meaning that, big corporations are resembling big government departments. That's happened under Conservative governments here. It's happened under Republican administrations over your side of the pond, Gerry. But I think it will accelerate under Labour. And I just worry that sort of spread, you can call it wokery, you can call it social legislation. But my worry is it's the tying up of business in political objectives that will most blunt its effect in the years ahead. And you're certainly right. Labour are very enthusiastic about all of that sort of legislative regulatory action.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, obviously, you push back if you wish, but comparisons are obviously being made between this Labour victory and Tony Blair's in 1997, and you've studied it more closely than I have, but I've studied British politics quite closely over the time. I think it's fair to say that Starmer, the new Labour Prime Minister, is some way to the left, kind of a brilliant, obviously an effective communicator, but part of his success was that he was really kind of very much in the mainstream of ordinary sort of British voters, if we can say that. My impression, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that Starmer is, again, let's say sort of instinctually, culturally, comes from a very much the modern progressive left in a way that I think that Blair didn't.
I think that's fair. I wouldn't quarrel with that. And I'd much rather Tony Blair was in office than Keir Starmer if I had to choose between the two. I think Tony Blair had a more of an instinctive feel for Middle England. He hasn't, for example, said in his youth that all immigration laws were racist, which was something that Keir Starmer famously said in his younger years, didn't take the knee during the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Tony Blair absolutely said, a woman doesn't have a penis, was something he said recently. Keir Starmer wasn't able to say that. The one thing that I think does, and I'm trying to see the silver lining here in the cloud, the one thing that Keir Starmer does possess, which I don't think we should understate, is that he's an older person. He's been in public service for quite a while. He's been involved in government administration, back to the point I was making earlier about the Conservatives' failure to govern competently. Yeah. I think he'll be a competent Prime Minister. I think he'll get immersed in the detail. I think he'll ensure that legislation is properly thought through. His general ministerial team is a bit weak and a bit thin, but some of the people at the top of his government have been there before. They're steeped in their briefs, and I hope perhaps they'll be a little bit more serious than some of the people in those early Blair years were.
I don't know why you think that's a source of consolation, Tim. I can't think of anything more scary than a competent social.
You make a good point, and I'd like to withdraw the remarks I made some moments ago.
But that's a good point. But look, we'll move on. But one thing I think people have been drawing much attention to, human rights lawyer, that's where he sort of made his name, very much in one of the famous barristers' chambers in London back in his early career. You just mentioned what he said about immigration. There is a concern, I think, which I think is justified, and you tell us if you think this is right too, that he really does see politics in the kind of slightly worrying legal framework, that he's one of these people, and we have them over here in the United States too, who want to take key crucial decisions out of the political sphere and make them judicial decisions and actually limit the ability of elected leaders to change laws and instead enshrine these laws in judicial activism and judicial fiat. I think a lot of people are worried about that. And again, we've seen that here in the United States. I think right now we have a Supreme Court which is rolling that whole judicial activism back. But I do think, my impression is from Starmer, and you tell me what you think, that again, in his experience, in his cultural record, and in his beliefs, he very much is a supporter of this idea of enshrining law, taking law away from politicians and elected representatives and handing it to judges.
I think that's very true. And a whole range of decisions now in the British state are handled by things we call quangos, quasi-independent government organisations. The Bank of England, of course, has control of monetary policy. Everything in Britain takes a long time to happen now. It's subject to judicial review. Civil service bureaucracies take ages to assess every action for whether it fits with environmental inequalities and other social objectives. One, though, little, I'm trying to be positive here, Gerry, despite your consistent pushbacks, is Britain hasn't built enough houses for a very long time. It's part of the reason why the Conservatives were rejected, because they haven't extended home ownership. One of the great problems in Britain at the moment is that young people are being priced out of the housing market. I've already referred to it. And a lot of the problem is a lot of the places where houses are most needed are in what have traditionally been Conservative-held seats. And those Conservative MPs have sort of basically not built houses because they're afraid of existing homeowners. I think Labour might address that problem, and certainly Keir Starmer has promised to build. Now, if he doesn't control immigration, that extra house building will be overwhelmed. But it's the one thing I most hope that this Labour government might deliver. It might deliver the scale of house building that will reintroduce young people to the housing and therefore ownership.
Look at the international picture. Interestingly, Keir Starmer, almost the first thing he does is come here to the United States next week for the NATO summit meeting in Washington next week. So he'll get an early period of time, assuming Joe Biden's awake, spend some time with President Biden over here. And of course, Labour was anti-Brexit on the whole, has been very critical of the government's approach. Two questions. I mean, what do you expect on the international front in terms of, are they going to try and undo Brexit and rejoin the European Union? And what sort of a relationship would you expect with the US, particularly one that could in a few months' time be led once again by Donald Trump?
Well, the man that Keir Starmer has proposed as his foreign secretary, we've got to await whether he actually appoints him to his cabinet in the next 24 hours, is David Lammy, who has compared Donald Trump basically to a fascist. Now, that was before he was appointed to that job. But it gives you a sort of indication of what a lot of people at the top of the Labour Party think of the Republican nominee. I think on Ukraine, the new British government will be solid. There's no sign at all that they will renege from the commitment to fight that war. Israel is a different matter. I think there's much more sort of pro-Palestinian, almost pro-Hamas in some sections of the Labour Party feeling. And one of the sort of significant footnotes in the election was that some Labour MPs were defeated by pro-Gaza independent MPs. There is a Muslim vote in Britain that's quite powerful, and they ousted Labour MPs that they perceived to be pro-Israel. And I'm not sure that Britain under Keir Starmer will be quite the friend of Israel that it was when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister.
And Brexit, will they try to undo Brexit, rejoin the EU?
I think there may be sort of stealthy attempts to sort of slightly get us back integrated with the European Union. But I think they don't certainly have the mandate to do that. Brexit wasn't really an issue in this election campaign. It was such a traumatic experience for Britain to leave the EU, the debate about it. I don't think Keir Starmer wants to return to that. He's got other priorities than reopening that very divisive wound in British public life.
Finally, Tim, before I let you go and sleep the sleep of the just, again, from over here in America, we're looking at this election. We see this election of a Labour Party. We see the routing of the Conservative Party. If you are speaking to a predominantly American audience, what is the overriding message of this election, do you think, as Americans themselves prepare to vote in just a few months' time?
I think behind the Trump revolt, behind the Brexit revolt, behind the revolts we're seeing across Europe, is a fundamental dissatisfaction from electorates, particularly blue-collar, male, perhaps downscale income voters, that the current economic settlement's not working for them. That feeling isn't going away. I think in many ways, it's getting stronger. And I still think the mainstream political parties haven't searched enough, haven't re-examined their policies on immigration, on what kind of level of tax they impose, on how they train workforces, of how they operate trade policies to really recognise this economic revolt that began in 2016 or so and is still alive today, perhaps stronger than ever.
Tim Montgomerie, thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression after 36 hours without sleep.
Thanks, Gerry.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thanks for joining us. I'll be back again next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.